Hello and welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. Welcome back to our stage, John Cleese, and also back to our stage, Judd Apatow. We hosted John in 2014 when his memoir, So Anyway, was published. He was interviewed by Eric Idle, and that video has over 2.2 million views in our YouTube channel. Judd has previously interviewed Brian Stelter, Mark Seliger, and Roger Daltrey for us, and all those videos are also in our YouTube channel. Today they discuss John's book, Creativity, a Short and Cheerful Guide. John needs no introduction. He's one of the co-founders of the legendary Monty Python comedy troupe. Judd, one of the most sought-after comedic minds in the industry, has directed, produced, and written many of the biggest comedy films and hit shows of the last 2 decades. Welcome again to both of you, and I will let Judd take it from here, and towards the end, we'll have some audience questions.
All right, John, how are you? I read the book. I love the book, by the way. I think it's so great that you wrote it. I'm a big fan of books about creativity. I think that as a young person, when I was trying to figure out how to write and just get my creative flow going, these types of books were essential to me. And why did you decide that you wanted to give this to the world?
I've been thinking about it for about 30 years. I got interested in creativity because I got into Cambridge. I got into show business through the footlights. And what I had always done was science and law, and I had any idea at all I had any creative ability. And suddenly I discovered I could write things that made people laugh. And I began to sort of notice things happening, like I'd work very hard at night trying to write a sketch, and then in the morning, I'd sit down with a cup of coffee before I'd really got going, and the answer would be there within 90 seconds. And I couldn't even quite see what the difficulty had been the previous evening when I'd been stuck. And I came to the conclusion that my mind was working on the problem when I was asleep. And then I began to realize it was working on the problem in my unconscious while I was awake. So I began to take note of what the unconscious was capable of. And the problem with the unconscious is that it's extraordinary what it can do. But you can't order it about. You can't hit it with a stick. You have to discover how to kind of coax it. Do you see what I mean? But I mean, what's your process when you sit down? Do you do lots of sharpening of pencils, making of coffee, and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I liked what you wrote about how boredom is essential. You have to allow yourself to be bored. And you know, for me, you know, I've read a lot about like noodling and just, you know, hanging around in silence. I like to like listen to music and try to let things bubble up. But it's a weird process because you're like, I'm going to enter a room alone and I'm just going to kind of sit there, and I'm assuming that something will be offered up to me to deal with. And I'm a big believer of what they call the vomit draft. You know, writing fast, not wondering why the hell you're writing it, just even babbling, just go, I'm going to type for the next 20 minutes. Anything that comes into my head. And then when I'm done, I'll switch into critical thought. And then I'll go, is there anything of value in this thing I just babbled out? And a weird amount of times there is.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much what I'm describing in the book. I think what was very important, I read about experiments that are being done by a psychologist called McKinnon at Berkeley in the 70s. And I knew a psychologist professor who said that the problem about writing about creativity is it's so much to do with the unconscious. It's what you can say about it is pretty limited. And he thought that some of the most important experiments had been done a long time ago, and then people had not really gone past them. But this guy McKinnon was very interested in professionals, and particularly in architects, because they had to be very efficient as well as very creative, because the bridges needed to stay up, if you see what I mean. And what he discovered when he compared the creative architects with the non-creative architects was that there were two differences. The important one was that the creative architects could play.
Yeah.
And I began to see that so much creativity was just to do with playing, which is what you've just been describing. When you say you just sit down and just start just any old nonsense, just start putting it down, have a look at it, see if it leads anywhere, you know. And that was a large part of it. And then I read a book by a Dutch historian who wrote Waning of the Middle Ages called Huizinga. And he wrote a book called Homo Ludens, meaning man playing man. And he made the point that you can only play in what he called a childlike way if that play was separate from ordinary life. And if you think, how is it that children can play with such great ease? And the answer is the parents are minding the shop.
Yeah.
The children don't have to think of things that they have to do or responsibilities. They can just play. And then when you play without any fear of making mistakes, just what you were saying, then stuff will arise. And at a certain stage, I would wait longer than you do to see what it's about, to bring in the critical thing. But you just play, and there's no such thing as a mistake, because it doesn't matter. If you made a mistake or misheard something that somebody else said, maybe that'll lead to something good.
And I always think about the critical voice. You know, we all have that voice in our head that's telling us that we're terrible and we should stop writing right now because no one will like it and you're a fraud. And so much of being in play is to tell that voice to shut the hell up and have fun. And that's really a big part of it, you know, for me, because I always have a little voice that sneaks up and is just going like, no one wants this. Nobody wants to hear from you. And I have to work on getting rid of it.
But I think if you can still that voice, and it's, you know, my psychologist professor friends pointed out, he said, if you're sad, you have sad thoughts. If you have if you're feeling angry, you have angry thoughts. So how do you get in a creative mood?
Yeah.
And that involves, I think, a little bit like meditation. It's the first time that you sit down and start just trying to think, well, what am I going to think about? You think I should have called Tom? I should have bought a birthday present for the cat. I haven't mended the roof, all this stuff. And you have to wait for that to settle, just like the Buddhists say. It's like a glass of cloudy water. Leave it there still and it will settle. And then after about 20 minutes, then those thoughts, I can't do this, I'm no good, I'm not as good as so, all that stuff you're talking about, that kind of settles and doesn't get in the way anymore, but it always does at the beginning. Once it's settled, then you could start being much more positive with your creativity. Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely. And I also think there's something about, you know, when you're young, it's different than when you're more experienced or when you've had success. Because when you're young, I think you're delusional, right? Like there's a feeling in your 20s for a lot of people that you can take over the world. And it is a form of madness. I mean, when you watch Monty Python, you feel it like, wow, these guys think they are the funniest fuckers on the planet. And they are, but what if they weren't? Then they would just be crazy people, right? And I think about when I was young, I lived with Adam Sandler and we were friends with Jim Carrey and Ben Stiller, and everybody had a sense that it was gonna work out. You know, there was a certain bravado that was completely unjustified for what we had done up to that point.
I think that was because you were Americans. I think
Americans.
more optimistic and positive than the British. I mean, I always had these feelings that I wasn't going to be any good. And what I discovered, particularly working with Graham Chapman, is that we could average 15 to 20 minutes good material a week. We might have a terrible day Monday and even not Tuesday morning. Then suddenly after lunch on Tuesday, it would all start flowing until about Thursday afternoon, and then we dry up again. So once you know there's a kind of average amount that you can write just by sitting there, then the bad times when you normally get negative and think I'm no good at this, that you just see them as part of the whole process. I remember a psychiatrist friend of mine saying, Gregory Bateson, once, who was married to Margaret Mead, once said that you can't have a new idea till you've got rid of an old one. And so sometimes when I'm having a very arid spell, I think to myself, it's okay, this is just part of the process. Just as in eating, it's not just good when the food's coming towards your mouth and then sort of a waste of time when the fork goes away without the food. It's all part of the same circle, right?
I remember I read somewhere that Mike Nichols said that in order to have a good idea, you have to have a lot of ideas. And that helped me when I was young. Like, oh, I have to come up with a lot of stuff to find a nugget.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. Because I say that if you follow basically the simple stages in the book, you will have ideas, but some of them will be terrible and some of them will be okay, and one or two will be really good. And you can go to the okay ones and think, well, which bit do I like and which bit is rubbish? And then you can start the creative process again, beginning from the stuff that you'd actually decided is okay.
I remember when I was first starting out, there was this book by Anne Lamott, and she said she had the down-up theory, which is get it down, and then later on, fix it up. And that was simple and helpful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of some of the time, particularly on judgment, when you go into the critical phase, one of the best things you can do is get away from it for a bit. You know, put it in a drawer for a week and then come back to it. And when Connie Booth and I were writing Fawlty Towers, if we got stuck, we just put one episode to one side, work on another episode. And then when you come back to it, there's two things happen. One is it becomes much clearer what's good and what isn't good because you've been away from it, and that gives you a certain objectivity. And the other thing is your unconscious has been working on it while you've been away, so you actually come up with ideas quite easily.
Isn't it weird that your brain does that?
Yeah, but I'm fascinated by the idea of the two hemispheres. I mean, this was around in the 70s when Roger Sperry got a Nobel Prize for cutting the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres, and then it got oversimplified. But there is a book called The Master and His Emissary by a lovely Scots guy called Ian McGilchrist, and I've read that and absorbed it. It's the most interesting book I ever read. Because the interaction between the two hemispheres is extremely complicated and they're very interlinked. But you could say that they have distinct personalities. And, you know, the left brain is the critical one that wants to know how to possess things and process them. And you know what I mean? It wants to sort of make things. And then the right brain is where the values come from. And I think we are going from one to the other. We start off in the ordinary life because we're more agitated and our minds are a bit more active. We start, you know, with the left brain, and then as the cloudy water settles, we get more into the right brain. And then after we've been in the right brain for a bit, we have to bring the left brain in to assess what we've done and see what's good and what isn't.
I also look at it from like the simplest point of view, which is, you know, I'll wake up from a dream and it'll be so imaginative and so bizarre and emotional. But I always just think, I just find it so strange that at night, my mind feels the need to create this little movie for me. And what the hell is that? And why in evolution would that happen?
Yeah, well, we need ideas, you know, and the hard thing is getting out of the left brain, because these days we have these phones calling all the time and interruptions, which is exactly what keeps us stuck in the left brain, stops us being creative. That's why I believe you have to basically sit down somewhere where you're not going to be interrupted. Yeah. And if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, you may have to sit in the park. Or one of my friends at Cambridge used to lock himself in the loo because he was in a family of 6. And you could do that. Or if you're a CEO, you just say to the secretary, shut the door, don't interrupt me unless the building's burning.
Yeah.
And that way you create a quiet place where you're not going to be interrupted, where the phone isn't ringing. And that's what enables you to sit there while the mind settles.
Yeah, I read somewhere that when you check your messages, that you cannot return to a fully creative state for about 20 minutes.
Yes, I've read something very similar. I read 12 minutes, but it's an extraordinary thought that if you're in a particular place writing something and you've got a character there and a character there and one shouting at that one and this person comes in, you take one phone call, it takes 12 minutes to get back to where you were before the phone call. or 20 minutes, as you say. And that serves as the deadliest thing when you're trying to be creative is interruption.
Some of the best thought I ever did was had an appointment and I got locked out. The people weren't there, and I sat down and I had been hired to do a punch up and to try to figure out some story problems on Adam Sandler's movie, The Wedding Singer. And I'm outside in an empty hallway waiting for the person to come back. They didn't come for an hour. And all I had was this big manila envelope and I didn't know what to do. So I just started outlining what the fix would be. And because I was so bored, the whole thing came to me sitting in the hallway.
It's extraordinary. We have a great playwright called Alan Ayckbourn, and almost every year he writes a great, funny play. His plays don't work so well in America because when English men go wrong, they become useless and ineffectual. Whereas, when American men go wrong, they become psychopaths. The American audiences aren't more interested in watching comedies about wimps, which is why it's better known. But he writes his plays in 3 days. And people say, how can you write and play in 3 days? And the answer is because you've been thinking about it for 362 days.
Yes, that used to happen when I was
no
working.
Fly Spirit in 3 days or something.
What did you say again? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I said Noel Coward wrote one of his best plays. I can't remember which one. He wrote it in 2 or 3 days. But of course, the point is he'd been thinking about it all that time. It's not some amazing rush of creativity. It was all stored up because he'd been thinking about it.
I believe that Sylvester Stallone wrote Rocky in a week or 2. That would be the example I would use.
Yeah.
As an American, I would say Rocky.
Yes, of course. That's what people don't understand is that it goes on and on working when you're not thinking about it. So even if you're not actually writing it down, you're still having ideas. I have an idea now, Judd, for the worst taste comedy that I've ever written, which is it's a light comedy about cannibalism.
Yes.
And it's called Yummy. And I'm just sitting around, I get ideas almost every day from something somebody says. You suddenly see people getting very upset about a wasp at lunchtime. And you suddenly think, that's going to be funny,
Yeah.
And you slowly build it. And what I discovered early on, I lost a sketch that Graham Chapman and I had written. I was always losing things, and I knew he'd be cross with me. So I wrote it out from memory when I gave up on finding it. And when I found the original, I compared them, and the second one was better.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to make it better. It was just that my mind had been improving it while it was lost. It's extraordinary what we can do with our minds. And there's a wonderful test where they showed some people, ordinary people, Chinese characters or, ideograms. And then they came back a week later and they showed them. And they said, some of these you saw last week, some you didn't. And they couldn't remember them at all. Mm-hmm. And then they repeated the experiments. The second week they said, can you remember seeing them? But they said, which ones do you like more than others? And they were quite clear. They did like some more than others, and they were the ones they'd seen the previous week. So the brain somehow knew which ones they'd seen, but it couldn't answer if it was asked directly.
It's like when someone tells you about something from your childhood that you forgot, and you couldn't have ever told them the story, but when they tell you the story, you remember it with them. But it's just deep in there somewhere.
It's deep in there. That's right. So you can't hit it with a stick or order it to send you a nice little message answering your question. But you get an image of I'm thinking of one thing, of a candle, and you suddenly and I didn't even think candle. I just looked at it for a time. And I thought, oh my God, that's what it is. The answer's a candle. So images, it's the language of the unconscious.
I wanted to ask you about spirituality in that, because there are some people who believe in, the emotional or the creative intelligence of the universe. I heard Tommy Chong from Cheech and Chong was on the radio, and he said, it's almost like some people, they've got their hose and they could hook it into the big pipe and get all the ideas. They just know how to do that. And other people don't know how to do that. Like Jimi Hendrix, he knew how to do it. Or Bob Dylan, there was a moment for years where he could hook into this. Do you ever think of it in those terms?
I don't, because I don't have experience like that. But I think those people and Mozart and geniuses do. I'm just thinking, I once saw Ian Holm, a wonderful actor who died very recently, and I saw him do King Lear twice in the same week because it was so good. I went back and I said to him afterwards, I said, how do you find the energy? I mean, it's such a long play and so, dramatic in an acting sense. And he said, I don't know where the energy's coming from. He said, it's as though it's passing through me without touching the sides. But I've never had an experience like that. I mean, I noticed on Python sometimes when we got together after we'd been writing on our own for a week, there'd be certain themes in everyone's piece of writing, as though in some strange way we'd been connected. I don't understand that. But then you discover that Leibniz and Isaac Newton discovered the calculus at almost exactly the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes I don't know, I think there are weird things going on. Do you have those experiences?
I do, and it's always connected to like a stupid, dirty joke somehow. I'll think of it. Like I'll think of a dirty joke, and I literally feel like God gave it to me. I don't know why, but because it'll come from nowhere. Like, I was working on the 40-Year-Old Virgin, and this is the dumbest joke ever, but I just had this image of him waking up in the morning, trying to urinate with an erection. And I ran around my house laughing hysterically, and I just went, I've never seen that in any movie, but it really it captures his virginity in some way. Yes. And then Steve Carell did it in this really funny way where he like leaned all the way against the wall to get the angle, and it's the dumbest joke, but I swear to God, I thought, this is my connection to God.
That's lovely. Well, I think the point is that when something comes up from the unconscious, you don't know where it came from, except presumably from the unconscious. I mean, I believe there are Nobel Prize winners who've been working on something for years, and then one day they're out walking the dog or something like that, and they just ding. Yes. And they have the idea that they got the Nobel Prize for. But some of them feel they don't really deserve it because it was just given to them for free. Well, it wasn't. It was given to them because they've been studying it for 25 years, But the sense of something being given as a gift, I have that sometimes, yeah.
And I always, think about you and Monty Python as having had a similar experience to the Beatles in the sense of a group of people holed up together, all with very different talents that served each other, but also that you continue to create even though everyone was paying attention and loved you so much, but you found a way to, continue to grow and change and push the limits. Did you guys feel that?
Yes, I mean, I thought that I didn't realize that the best teams have got completely different abilities. The individual members. It's quite clear that and Jones wrote ideas for sketches that were quite different from anything that Graham and I came up with, and Michael Palin the same. And at one stage, I tried to improve on that by actually saying, well, instead of my writing with Graham, why don't I write once occasionally with Michael Palin, with Eric, because then we'll come up with something that's slightly different. But the others, the force of habit overcame this. And there were a small number of sketches I wrote with Palin and Idle, and they were all, I thought, rather good. But we lost that. We could have gone on longer and created more stuff together if we'd broken up the writing partnership.
Yeah. I have a funny Graham Chapman story, which is I was in college in 1985, and Graham Chapman was doing a tour of America at colleges, and he was showing clips from Monty Python and clips of that group, the dangerous
the dangerous sports people, yeah.
I mean, it was really like an earlier version of Jackass, where these people would like ride a bed down a ski slope or something. It was just a lot of dangerous stunts. And he was, I don't know if he was part of the group or just a supporter of the concept of the group. But I was 18 or 19 years old. And I was one of the people who was in charge of like the speakers at University of Southern California. And Graham gave his speech, and it was hilarious and wonderful. And then afterwards, a few of us went to go hang out with him and just spent 3 or 4 hours chatting with him. And he was the nicest, funniest man. It was a life-changing kind of night because
Really?
he did something, John, that really affected me, which is he was as interested in our stupid college lives as we were in his stories about getting hookers with Keith Moon. You know, he really
Yes.
was interested, and he was asking questions, and we're all just like idiots. And he was enjoying our company, and but then telling us like some of the funniest anecdotes we'd ever heard. And he was just a very special, kind man.
Yeah, he was extraordinary, and he was quite weird sometimes. I mean, I was talking to a theatrical producer who'd done a tour of his, and he said when Graham arrived at one city, he suddenly said he wanted 6 large salmon, fresh salmon, untouched, and the guy thought he must be on some strange diet. And all he did was he came out at the end of the show with these fish and threw them into the audience.
Yeah.
And the promoter said it was the biggest dry cleaning bill he'd ever seen. It's just the sort of random thing that Gray would do. And that's it. You have to be prepared to be random because you don't know what your unconscious is going to throw up. And it's not going to throw it up neatly typed out. You know, it's going to throw it up as some stupid idea, like the guy with the erection who has to have a pee.
Yes, every once in a while, it's a really good, more thoughtful idea. What is it like? Name one.
Well, it's usually the really silly stuff. The stuff that just makes people laugh and laugh and laugh is very often the purely silliest. If you take, you know, the fish slapping dance for Michael.
Yes.
Slapping fish. So people can watch that again and again and again. It's absolutely stupid and it means absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So sometimes these, you know, some of these pure ideas, there's just a pureness that you don't know where they came from.
And when you were writing all of that, what kind of energy was it coming from? Obviously, there was a lot of poking fun at the establishment and the class system, but was it coming from intelligence and confidence? Was it coming from anger? Like, what was the general overall vibe about why you were doing this?
Well, Gray and I soon discovered that if it came from anger, it wasn't funny. If we got angry about something, usually that the conservative government was doing, and we try and write about it, because of the anger, it just wasn't funny. And we had to let go of the anger, and then maybe later, a few days later, we could be funny about it. I think it simply came as we used to sit there. I used to open up a thesaurus. If we didn't, after 10 minutes, and I just read words out to him. I say cucumber, you know, and we sort of look at cucumber. Probably not. No, you know, and then I'd say plummet.
Yeah.
And I said plummet once, and Graham said, "Oh, I like plummet. I think plummet's good." And I said, "What would plummet?" And he said, "Well, a sheep would plummet." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, if a sheep tried to fly, it would plummet." And that gave us a sketch, you know, about sheep that were trying to learn to fly because they could escape their inevitable fate with mint jelly.
Yeah. Well, that's how you get a dead parrot sketch, I guess.
Well, that was original. That was more logical because we wrote one that was based on an experience Michael Palin had with a second-hand car salesman, and then we thought it was very hackneyed because it was out of a second-hand car. And then we sat there for some time, and we said, "Well, what could it be?" And then I don't know. One or the other of us said, "Well, it could be an animal."
Yeah.
When he takes it back to the pet shop because it's not working properly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we played around with, well, what would the animal be? And we said, well, it can't be a mouse because that's too small and sweet, and people like cats and dogs too much. So then somebody said, well, Gray said, I think he said, why not a parrot? I said, well, that's great because nobody likes parrots. And not even parrots like parrots. So nobody's going to feel sympathetic for the fact is. And then we wrote it about the parrot. And I got the thesaurus back out and found all the synonyms for dead.
Yeah.
And make, I can't remember them all.
Yeah.
Hop the Twig and all of those, and we just put it together like that.
Well, when we were doing
playing, isn't it? That's the point, is you don't know where you're going. I see a parallel in science, because Einstein once said if when you're doing research you knew what you were going to find out, it wouldn't be research.
Yes.
And that's a nice thought. And the main thing with creativity is you don't know where it's going. And my experience of the film business, and I really want to know what you think about it, is that when they commission a film, they want to see something immediately to know what they're getting. Whereas they would get much better if they just said, go away and come back in 4 months.
Yeah, I think it's essential to find people.
Pressure, you go to cliches.
I mean, you definitely need people that understand your process.
Yeah.
And when you have executives that understand you and support you, you know, I've been lucky enough to work with the same film studio for 15 years, and they just know the flow of how it happens. So
the key is they trust you.
Yes, yes. And
right.
It's hard at the beginning when they don't. When you're young and they don't trust you, then they want to be involved in your process.
That's right. And also they want to see what you're doing as soon as possible, because they think that they know what would work. And of course, as Bill Goldman said, nobody knows. Nobody knows. But you're more likely to come up with something if you're not under time pressure, because if you go under time pressure, that's one of the pressures that pushes you into the left brain, and then you become less creative and you just start doing something that's been based on what you've done before.
I always tell writers that if you write an outline, as soon as you write it out really well, you'll never be as imaginative with it again once it's laid out, because you'll have shut down so many paths that might be correct because it's kind of organized now.
That's right. And I find the best thing, if I've got a story like the cannibal story, I keep telling it to people. And there's always a moment when I'm telling the story when you can see you lost them.
Yes.
That's what you got to fix. You see what I mean? And then you
exactly.
fix that in the story, then you tell it to someone else and you lose them at that point, and then you fix that point until you gradually get to the end.
And what was it like for you looking back now at the reunion concerts that you guys had the chance to do that and have that experience as friends?
Well, it was a very strange experience because we got into financial trouble. We've always had hopeless managers, completely fucking hopeless managers. And we discovered we owed £800,000 in legal fees because something had not been settled. And we called in an old friend of ours from Cambridge who used to manage Queen, or still does manage Queen. And he said, well, just do a show at the O2. So we did it for money. And Eric, we were all busy. Eric had a few days off, and he put a very good script together of all the sketches that we knew that were going to work. And when we read it, it was a wonderful experience, Judd, because we started to laugh, and we really laughed. And this is material, you know, that's been around for 40 years. But because we found it funny, we found out that we were looking forward to doing the shows. And of course, the shows were very strange because normally the people in the audience don't know the dialogue better than the actors. It was a very strange event, but very lovely.
And how was it just as friends to work together? Because, you know, people don't always remember that you guys, you know, you toured America doing these shows at the Hollywood Bowl. I mean, you traveled like rock stars in that period, which must have been a strange thing to have this TV show and then suddenly you're a concert event.
Well, it's very strange because comedians on the whole don't do that in the way that bands do. You know, it's the most common thing in the world. Why doesn't it happen with comedians? And the answer is I don't really know. I mean, it often happens that two comedians work together, but not a larger group than that. And all I can say is it was the usual thing. Sometimes we got cross with each other, but we always thought the material was funny. And of course, the sound of laughter, as you know, probably better than mine. I mean, it's one of the loveliest sounds in the world. And it's hard to be very cross if you've just been in front of an audience that would be laughing a lot.
And when you look back at like the amount of stuff you all did together, because, you know, I think all of us, you know, we wind up in groups of one kind or another. And I notice it in my world, how many of the people that I thought would work together their whole lives have split up or they get into a fight, or they become disinterested in each other, and some people come back together, some people don't. How do you feel about what the sine curve was of how much you guys work together?
I think we got together at exactly the right time. Exactly the right time, and also from the point of the BBC, because we went into the pitch meeting, which was arranged by a guy called Barry Took, who used to write with Monty Python. And we went in, and the guy in charge of comedy, Michael Mills, said, "Well, what do you propose doing?" And we hadn't discussed it. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so we kind of ad-libbed a rather limp thing, and he asked us a couple of questions. You're going to have music and guest artists. We said, well, we never really thought about that. And then he looked at us and shrugged and said, go away and make 13 programs. The most extraordinary thing. Nobody's ever commissioned a show before without knowing what they were getting. But the very fact that we'd not given a concept meant that when we got down to it, all we did was write. We weren't trying to fit anything into an idea that we'd had. And I think that was why it was in a way so creative, because there was no sense that we had a sort of, this is what the show's got to be like.
Isn't it strange when something that was funny a long time ago is equally as funny now? I mean, doesn't it surprise you, just the timelessness? And again, I do equate it to the Beatles, because they'll have the Beatles channel on Sirius Radio, and you'll turn it on and go, yeah, this is still better than everybody else.
Well, I think what we found, I was always envious of the rock musicians, because they literally made 50 times as much money as we did.
Yeah.
But it was a little bit like that. And I used to think to myself, they're lucky. If they write a good song, people can hear it again. They can hear it 2 minutes later. They can encore it straight away, and people will still like it. Whereas if I tell you a joke and then tell it to you 2 minutes later, you're not going to laugh. And then something started to change. And we suddenly realized that people were learning the sketches in the same way that people can quote Bob Dylan's lyrics,
Yes.
And there was a change that I've never understood. I mean, we benefit from it, and it's great fun. I mean, once when I was on stage with Michael Palin and he broke me up, made me laugh, I couldn't think what the next line was.
Yeah.
And I just said to the audience, what's the next line? And about 60 people shouted it out. So, I mean, what is the point of this if you know it better than we do? But it changed, and I still don't understand it.
Did you watch the documentary of the making of the reunion concerts?
Yes, I think I saw most of it. I think, yeah.
What did you make of just watching yourselves as friends relate to each other and try to support each other during these shows, which are difficult shows to do?
There was a good feeling of fellowship. Yeah, but in respect to what you said earlier, we very much, after a certain time when we were together, we very much went off in different directions. I mean, Terry Gilliam went off basically to be a film director. None of the rest of it. You know what I mean? Then Michael Palin got fascinated by the travel programs. Well, that's given them. My main interest is in psychology, and I had a company that made management and sales training films for a time. So we all eventually settled in different directions, but that was because we were really quite different people.
I was always fascinated by your interest in psychology and the management videos. I remember reading your book, Families and How to Survive Them, because
really?
I definitely needed to know how to survive them. And I thought, this is the exact book I need right now. So just talk a little bit about your interest in, self-help, and also what the reaction has been, years down the line from people who you have helped. I mean, I know with that type of self-help, it does have a major impact on people's lives.
Yes, it does, because the guy I wrote it with, you see, when my first marriage was breaking up, number one, that'd be the number, but number one was breaking up, I went to a group run by this guy, Robin Skinner, and at the beginning, I didn't really get what he was talking about, because my education, Cambridge and so forth, law and science, had been so left brain. And suddenly I realized this guy knew more about the way people behave than anyone else. And I don't think there's anything more interesting than the way our minds work. I mean, nothing else seems to be comparably interesting to what's going on inside here. And so I suggested to him at one point that we should, after I left the group, I got to meet him and we became friends. I suggested we should do a television series. And the extraordinary thing was there wasn't a single television company that was interested.
Yeah.
But just, I remember one of them said, we don't make programs of this kind. You know, there's a very English thing about not talking about emotions. And I've always had a connection with America because it always struck me, you guys were much more open about your emotions. The English are very, very guarded. And I married 3 Americans and I have a lot of American friends. So I think I was very affected in a good way by a lot of the American culture. But it's very, very warming when people say that they read this book, and it's still recommended by psychiatrists to people going into therapy for the first time. And it's also, you know, I always thought that Python was really funny and it was good for people to laugh. But I began to realize in the last 10 years that we were doing a bit more than that, really, Judd, because people come up to me after the show, and men of 70 shake me by the hand and say, thanks for making me laugh all these years. And there's a tear in their eye.
Yeah.
It's meant something to them more than just laughter. And I think it's because it's the Python is just saying life is insane. You know, this planet that we're on, it's ridiculous. Nothing works. Nobody knows what they're doing and all this kind of thing. And once they've got that idea that the place, after about 6 shows, a friend of mine said, what I love about Python, he said, is after I've watched an episode, I simply cannot watch the news. I cannot take it seriously. And I think that's the really important thing that we do for people is say, you can't take this seriously. You know?
Especially, I feel like in this time, we definitely hear from people who say, hey, I just watched all those movies the last few days. I did my marathon of all your stuff. Thank you. It got me through a few moments. I'm sure you must be hearing that now a lot.
A lot, but I mean, I think the turning point for me was I went to Sarajevo and to a film festival, and they told me that, well, they were under siege by the Serbians for 4 years. The Serbians were sitting up in the hills, lobbing shells down, and people with telescopic sights were picking off people who were walking across the road in Sarajevo. I mean, it was horrible. And in the evening, they'd found an underground garage and they set it up as a small cinema, and they used to go in there and laugh at a lot of Monty Python stuff and other stuff too. They used to laugh, especially Monty Python. And what they said to me is we came out feeling better. Nothing had changed. You see what I mean? Nothing about the shells or the change, but they came out feeling more optimistic about life and more able to go on. And when you realize that comedy has that effect, you start realizing, or I started to realize, it's more important than I used to think it was. Does that ring a bell?
I had a similar experience. I was at a Mexican restaurant and my waitress says to me, I never say anything to people I recognize, but I want you to know that I was an interrogator in Iraq. And we used to watch Superbad and Knocked Up at the end of hard days to just relieve our pressure, and it really helped get us through, and thank you. And I was so moved because it clearly was important to her. But then I thought, well, what did I do? Give her more energy to interrogate and waterboard people?
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. That's very, very interesting.
I would assume that's why people always, you know, when they, you know, keep singing, always look on the bright side of life. That's what they mean. You know, they need to hear that life is total madness. I made a documentary about Gary Shandling, and I found something he wrote in his diary, and he wrote, maybe your comedy is a gift that you give to people to help them through this impossible life with no hope of getting anything in return. And I thought that's it.
No, that's very good. Yeah. I don't know what to say. It's just very, very extraordinary. I mean, I think that the purpose of laughter, from an evolutionary point of view, is to relax us after stress. Because once we're in the thrall of the left brain with tick, 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 we're worrying about that and planning that and being resentful about that. And then if we laugh, it simply moves us to the right brain, where there's relaxation and a sense of meaning of life and all these kind of things that you simply don't get from the left brain. So I think that's its evolutionary purpose.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that was a very good example of it, wasn't it? You know, they're so tense after the interrogations, they got one watching comedy is better than anything else, including taking any drugs.
It's meant to help us relax after a hunt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, it also relates to, what people need to relax, because there's so many different types of comedy. Some people like gentle comedy and harmless comedy, and other people want really dark comedy. They can't get off unless you say the worst thing ever, which relates to all these debates about political correctness and people's ability to be consumers of really nasty comedy. And I know you had that experience where they took down one of the episodes of Fawlty Towers, which seemed ridiculous. It feels a little, I've heard you talk about this, where there's this debate about what is appropriate and not, but I always think about the person that wants you to go all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people do. And one of the great advantages when I do my stage shows now is that the audience are 45 and older, and they don't give a damn about PC stuff. They laugh. And I do a lot of material about why can we make jokes about Germans if we can't make jokes about Mexicans. And it's a very interesting point, because you start realizing the attitude of Mexicans is very condescending.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? We have to protect them because they can't stand up to jokes in the way that Germans and Swedes and Canadians and Australians can. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
That there's something very, very, condescending about the attitude, and also that they're doing it a great deal of this PC stuff in order to experience this warm glow of moral superiority. I think the thing that's very, very obvious about them is that they lack a sense of proportion, and I think a sense of humor is a sense of proportion, because it's kind of saying, well, this is serious and this isn't. Most of it isn't.
What was the detail in the episode that they had issue with?
Oh, we had the old major who was, sort of been out there in the Indian Army or something like that, was talking about explaining to his girlfriend the difference between these various insulting terms that we have. We call the Spaniards dagos, and we call the Italians wops, and we call the Egyptians wogs, and all this. And he was explaining this in this very serious way. And of course, the whole purpose of it was to make fun of the fact that he had these categories so clearly laid out in his mind. But people don't understand. You can make fun of things in two ways. You can either attack them, or you can put the words that you don't like in the mouths of people that you then make to look very stupid.
Yes, I think one thing that I always get concerned about is that we need the ability to have characters who are allowed to make terrible mistakes and say terrible things. Like certain people, if in life they wouldn't get it, then you can't take away that the world is filled with mean people or idiots, and we should be able to have those characters and mock them in whatever way we need to.
Because there's nothing funny about a perfect person. If you wrote a character who was really kind and intelligent and thoughtful and wise, no laughs there. Somebody once said to me, an American once said to me, you show me a sitcom about St. Francis of Assisi and I'll show you a bummer.
Yeah.
Because comedy is about things going wrong and people going wrong.
Yeah. And tell me about your live performing now. So you go out, I know you go out with Eric Idle and do some shows together sometimes, and you also go out by yourself. And, how's that for you now? And what are you trying to accomplish in those shows?
Well, I just try to make people laugh. I go into theaters. I used to like smaller theaters. Now I've got used to sort of places of 2,000 or sometimes 2,500. The usual side's about 1,200, 1,500. And I just go out and I make them laugh. And it's a very simple way of making money. Because after the show, the tour manager goes backstage and talks to the guy on the box office, and it's all clear. You know what I mean? There's no studio coming up with huge expense, very straightforward. And also, there's something very satisfactory about the pure transaction of standing in front of people, making them laugh. And I played a show at the Acropolis in Athens last year and stood there on the stage and thinking that 2,000 years ago, people were standing exactly here and making the audience laugh. There was a lovely sense of continuity or history about it.
It's kind of amazing to, at this point in your career, land as, partly a stand-up comedian.
Well, it's true, but I'm afraid it's really like the Python show was a result of the legal bills. My stand-up shows are really the result of my last divorce. Because I had to buy this woman with $20 million, and that makes a bit of a dent in your savings, particularly if you spend most of your life working for the BBC.
Yeah.
If I made it on American television, it would have been such a problem.
Now, you've written a lot of self-help books. So if there was a common complaint about you that all of your wives had, what would it be?
Well, I used to be much more tense and uptight. Now I've got much more relaxed, and I've also got a wife that I really, really like. It's awfully nice having to have a wife that you like. You know, but I really love her, and I have a lovely group of friends. So I don't feel I have anything much to prove now, and I'm much less anxious. And somebody once said to me, let me try and think what he said. He'd been a Batman to a general. The general had said to him, very few things matter much, Walter, and most things don't matter at all. And somehow that opinion is now, it colors my life. I mean, I don't expect things to go right. So when I have a day filming like we had today, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And you've been interested in psychology your whole life and your own behavior your whole life. What is the main wisdom that you have now that you may not have had 40 years ago?
Well, I think the realization that you can't get things right. Most of the time we're making mistakes. Sometimes they're big mistakes, sometimes they're small mistakes, but usually you can correct them before a real damage is going. So you don't spend your whole time trying to not make mistakes. You know, the English are like that. There was a speech in A Fish Called Wanda when I said, do you think you know what it's like being English? Going through life just trying to get everything right and not upset people. Whereas if you can just let go and say, well, there's always going to be some people who hate me anyway, then that frees you up. And when you're trying to present an image to somebody that you're really a super person all the time and very kind and intelligent, you know more than you do and that you earn more than you do, all that sort of ego stuff, that puts us under a pressure that makes it much harder for us to actually be ourselves.
And how does that affect these friendships that you've had for 50, 60 years when you guys are all together and laughing and talking about your journey and what you've taken from this, long journey of creativity and humor? What are you talking about now that you didn't talk about with each other back then?
Well, it totally depends on whether I'm talking to my English friends or I'm talking to my American friends, because I find my American friends are much more interested in the strange stuff. I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of parapsychology or psi phenomenon that is really proven. And I'm amazed that scientists are not even curious about it. They're frightened of it because they can't explain it. And those are the kind of conversations I tend to have with my American friends. And my English friends, the conversation is very warm, but a little more old-fashioned. And, probably about less controversial subjects, most of them.
And what about parenting? You know, what have you learned over the course of your life about how to be a good parent?
I think it's the hardest thing in the world because you never get any immediate feedback about whether you're getting it right. You've got to
Yeah,
try something, and then in 15 years' time, you think, well, that worked or that didn't work.
exactly.
I think it's extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
And I've had both of my relationships, my daughters, has been difficult times, and I'm very, very happy now that the relationship with both of them is really warm and accepting. And it's really that and a nice wife and 4 good cats. What else do you want except for a bit of
Yeah.
money?
Well, let me say this. I'm all about cats, John. I am full in on this cat thing. I got 2 cats about 2 years ago. I don't think I would have survived this COVID era if I didn't have 2 nice cats around.
Absolutely. I always say I'd much rather lose a friend than a pet.
Yeah.
You know, 'cause you can always make another friend. You know,
Yes.
but I mean, when a pet goes, it's much worse than a friend because they're part of your everyday furniture of your life. Wife and I have got these 4 cats. We got 3 American ones, Maine Coons, and one of them is 20. My wife holds it up. You can just see her hair, you know, and her legs. We use the most magnificent route by having a saddle made for him so she can ride it around the flat.
So it's an enormous cat.
It's the biggest cat you ever saw. And there's something about having big cats. They just seem to be bigger personalities. I don't know. What are yours?
I have 2 Siberian cats.
Oh,
They
that's
couldn't be more important to us. And I would say what I learned by getting these cats is that my family, we like the cats more than we like each other. This
that's
is what we
right.
figured out.
They're much nicer. And they're
Yeah,
much
but
better than children. I mean, children are basically a dead loss. You know, you worry yourself sick about them. They cost a fortune, and then they grow up like their mothers. But
we figured out that our love for the cats is what is bonding all of us to each other
yes,
at this point.
that's exactly right. I think they're the most important things in the world. And I really think, Judd, oh, look at them. Oh, my God. I think what's so important about cats or dogs is that they're in the moment. They never think about the future or the past. They're just there in the moment. And while we're playing with them, we're in the moment too. And I think that's the incredible value they bring to our lives.
And they don't know there's a pandemic.
So are we going to get some questions or what?
Yeah, let's do it. Ted?
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. A few questions. Mr. Cleese, in your book, So Anyway, you mentioned that the only genius that you ever worked with besides Peter Sellers was Jimmy Burrows. What was it about his creativity that was genius?
It was just extraordinary how he held the whole show in his head. I did a Cheers with him, and then I did 6 Will and Graces. And when there were last-minute line changes, he knew the changes better than the actors did. It was just extraordinary how he held it all in his head and made it all happen. That's why I thought he was a genius. But I think the genius of Peter Sellers was as a performer, but the genius of Peter Cook was the genius of a writer, because you could sit with one of our great writers, I forgot his name, Frank Muir once said about Peter Cook, he could sort off by the yard. If you wanted 30 minutes of comedy material, all you needed to do is put a tape recorder down and start it, and 30 minutes later you had 30 minutes. Cookie was extraordinary. Not a great actor, but a wonderful, wonderful comic, wonderful sketch actor.
Creative ideas, even really good ones, are often a difficult sell. What advice do you have for presenting creative ideas to others?
Well, I think you've got to tell the story. I think you've got to be able to sit and tell the story without looking at notes. And so I think you have to rehearse. And I think it's better to have a performer. If you're selling a story, I think it's much better to have a performer pitch the story to the executives. A much better chance they'll understand it, because by and large, and I'm so pleased you've had a good experience with your people, Judd, but my experience has been largely the executives simply don't know what they're doing. But they don't know that they don't know.
That's
We
the
just
key.
get in the way. And if they could only just trust the good people and say, well, he's got a good record and we don't know it's going to be a success, but he has a better chance than most people, or she has a better chance than most people, then I think we get many more good shows, especially good comedies.
Monty Python members were enormously creative. How much of that creativity was collaborative versus individual?
Oh, yeah, it was a mixture. It was a mixture. We were very good when we got together. I remember Eric Idle saying, he said once, I mean, you wouldn't get expert criticism of your sketch anywhere else that's as good as what you get in a Python script meeting, people making suggestions or saying what's wrong and could be corrected. So I think that was very good, but we accepted the fact that we were all very different and we listened to each other on slightly different things. I mean, Gilliam is most extraordinary at producing images, but not so good at telling a story. And we were all like that with strengths and weaknesses.
How do we remain creative during challenging times? How creative do you feel you are now during this pandemic? How's your writing, if you are writing?
I don't find there's any difference. I don't know if I can say anything more interesting than that. I just, because I'm an introvert and I'm perfectly happy to give me an exercise book or even better, a sketch pad, because when I'm doing a story or a movie, I love to have a huge sketch pad and I get an idea of the beginning of the film. And then you ever do that?
You draw, you mean?
Yeah, no, not draw it. Just simply write the ideas on a huge piece of paper, like those big sketch pads you get. And I find that if I do that and that, then I think, well, that would go in the middle of the film, and that would go at the end of the film. If I have the whole thing in front of me. What I don't like about writing onto a computer is I have to keep what I mean with
yes.
It's all there.
I use a giant dry erase board most of the time.
Oh, did you? How big is it?
I mean, it literally, it's gigantic. And then I found a computerized dry erase board. So I found a way to take something that costs $20 and make it cost $20,000.
Yes. It's always good. It's always a good first step. Very good. Any others, Ted?
Yes, we have a couple more. With the rise of cancel culture, what are your thoughts on separating the art from the artist?
I just think people should be exposed to all sorts of tremendous range of stuff. And if they discover they don't like something, then they shouldn't watch it or go to that performer's shows. But the idea they should stop other people from hearing it is just insane. I mean, what it means, it's a bit like having a party and then the maiden aunt or the maiden uncle comes down the stairs and you have to start all behaving very well and having a boring time for 20 minutes till they go back upstairs and you can start having fun again. I mean, some people are trying to sort of measure the sensitivity of our culture by looking at the people who are most easily upset.
Yes.
And that's insane. They're most easily upset. We can't say anything because it'll upset people. I mean, what is the point of that? You could say that if those people don't want to hear certain things, then don't listen to them. But to stop other people from hearing is just insane.
Two questions. How did you come up with the silly walk?
I didn't. It was Terry Jones's idea. I never thought it was as funny as everyone else.
That's because you're the one who looks ridiculous. Like to you, you have a beautiful body and you walk normally, but you can't get the fact that you look crazy.
I did it very well, but it wasn't my idea. It was very much Jonesy's idea.
And our final question, how do you get through creative blocks or writer's block?
Well, we talked about this earlier, which is if you can have the confidence of knowing that you've done this and come out the other side before, you just accept that you've got a block, but you don't beat yourself up. You don't think I'm no good at this or, all those thoughts. You don't listen to them, even if you have them. You just ignore them because you just now and again, you will find that it doesn't come. Now, I've never had a major writer's block. I've had short-term writers. If you have major, I was married to a therapist, and she had 2 or 3 patients, all men who'd had a creative block, and she helped them to free it up. You might need help like that, but I can't speak about it because I've never had it myself personally.
I think they say that writer's block is just a pause before a breakthrough.
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying earlier. It's letting go of old ideas so that you can fill the space with new ones.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thanks again, Judd, for joining us and doing another one of our events. John, great to have you back on our
Lovely
stage.
to have you. Now I've got to run downstairs and do some filming.
You've got to do some comedy right now. So
Great.
let me take a picture of us, John, together. Ready?
And John's book again is Creativity, a Short and Cheerful Guide, and it is available wherever books are sold.
Judd, I hope we can meet sometime.
Yes, please. I'm here in California. I'm waiting for you.
Great. All right. I don't know when I'm coming, but when I come, we'll eat.
Excellent. All right, take care. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.